Right. So would like to continue with our land issue, but as of yesterday, we managed to establish that the whites had created sort of a segregation system in which they had their own type of life, whilst the Africans, or whilst they gave us our own type of life. So we have to start, or we have to continue with or we have to resume with the 1930 Land Apportionment Act. The word apportionment has the word portion in it. So the word portion means a part. In Shona Kajimedu cannot piece. So you know the Land Apportionment Act, the whites took all the land and they began to partition it or to share it amongst themselves. And they began to designate and give names to some parts of the land. So it was enacted as a result of the settler demands that it specified white and African land as well as unoccupied land. So the reason why they came up with the Land Apportionment Act, it was to sort of distribute the land in the sense that there was supposed to be land for the whites, there was supposed to be land for the blacks, then there was supposed to be unoccupied land. So in 1920, the white settlers, who numbered about 50,000, were allocated 4,914,174 acres of land. Like they took 51% of the total land, which the blacks who numbered about about 1 million people, were allocated over 21 million acres of land, and the rest of the land, right, was turned into game parks and state land, you know. So the land that was taken from that by the whites dominantly, it was arable land, it was fertile land. So the Land Apportionment Act of 1930 confirmed and legalized the displacement of Africans that had been going on earlier on. Reserves became reserved for exclusive use by Africans. Between 1930 and 1977, this act was amended up to 60 times. Like they kept on changing the law so that it can suit them. Yes, that's because you amend a law so that it can suit your own narrative. So it was meant to further entrench white control on land. They were so determined to ensure that the whites have the land for good. So by the 1930 Land Apportionment Act, Africans were completely stopped from acquiring land in areas completely considered to be Europeans. So I think we also touched on the Maurice Carter Commission, in which we explicitly stated that there was now a certain type of life that was enjoyed by the whites than by the blacks. So according to the Land Apportionment Act, the plan here was to ensure that apapane land yema whites isikambofia kabatwa like kuto segregator. Because the type of segregation or the apartheid that they came through with was to ensure that they won't mingle, they won't mix on everything. I think I explained the issue of residential areas. There were houses for the blacks, houses for the whites. There were schools for the blacks, schools for the whites. There were hospitals for the blacks, hospitals for the whites. Like they created a certain world for the Africans on their own. Then they created their own fairy tale beautiful world. Right. So it's the same thing they also did in as much as the land is concerned. They created land for the blacks. On everything, you know. So the argument for implementing the 1930 Land Apportionment Act was that the whites feared being swallowed by the black majority. Because that's why Pashamswa phrase it black majority, because my blacks are going from my whites. So my whites I told you which is Zarana Sterek Wachiwanda, but not immense. That Garata Ganura. So if there was no legalized discrimination, so it was meant to separate the civilized from the uncivilized. Because they are more civilized than us. So it introduced racial division of what? Of land in the country, racialized division of land in the country, and enactment of the Land Apportionment Act itself became a symbol of white domination in the country, and it aimed at reducing areas of contact between the whites and the blacks, like Awafan Tombosaka. So the Africans were dispossessed of more fertile land, and this act reserved some land even for forest, yet blacks did not have enough land to practice agriculture. Imwe land yakatonzi ndeye masango, imagine. So of all the land, 7.8 became African purchase land, which was meant to accommodate a few rich black people. Papa no wangu ma blacks mbinga. No muzwana chitora. Kuno waikato na makambani mabazi kana mashops kuma 1960 70. Ma blacks, they were there.
I've always wondered.
Yes, they were there. But vazhinji vacho vainzi ndo kuromba steering nekuita sei, ende vazhinji vacho vainzi vanga vari vatengesi. Bozi varungu papa nevanga vairawo legitimate, but zvazvirire. Pane vaitoona mataxis, mabhazi amwe aenda mumamisha. They were owned by like the what? There were some blacks who even owned even the best land. They could buy it. So the Africans purchased the land ranging from 41 to 243 hectares. It was administered by the native board. So Africans who purchased this land did not have titles for it. If one wanted to sell the land, you would have to have approval of the board. Like there was a board which was set up with you African uchida kutengesa land yako. Zvaipfuura nekubhodiko ndo yaizvesa zvidhindo kuti zvinoita here kana kuti hazviiti. So by this act, all urban areas were demarcated as falling on European areas, and only working Africans were to reside in these areas. Kare muno ma urban areas maingogara vanhu vaishandira varungu. Nazvo chinoti varungu vangokaisa nemaindustry yawo nechi. Ukatasa kumaflats kwazara kumatapu kwakusikatokubvunzi kugaramo. Takazotangoita bvunga toita after independence. Ndosaka chinoti masewage nemvura iko zvine vichinetsa sometimes. Why? Because there is overpopulation. That's how we expressed our independence, kufarira independence. Yes. Kare pane vainzi vana sisidhori, ukaoneka uri mukadzi uchitenderera muno maitozikanwa kuti you are problem. Kare vana mgogo nana mama nana vaigara musha. Baba angatori mabachelors flats. Then later on varungu pane pavakatanga kuzolakisa mitemo yavo, vanga vakutanga ndosaka chinoti kuna high fields nekuna nambari. Kuna high fields nekuna nambari ndo kwakatanga zvemaflats izvozvo. Maflats anga ari mabachelors flats. Ende ukatasa kune ndakambogara mumashawa kune munotodzi musiwo mamune zvimwe zvinenge zvimastove zvazvirimo futi nezvimaoven nechichi ndo maibikira vanhu futi. Pane maitonzi makitchen anga ari pakati pekuti munhu waiti kana wabva wabasa ungopinda makitchen imomo ndo maibikira. Mamune ironing area futi. Varungu varongeka. Then pointer mainzi musiwo mamuri but kwakuri kurongeka kwekuita vanhu kushandisa vanhu. Kurongeka kwekushandisa vanhu kuti vanhu vave comfortable kuti vatishandire. Iwo siya mhuri uchishanda kutown. So mabhazi aya aizotakura vanhu kumbare ndo ekutoti munhu aizotenga tumagrosari oisa pabhazi. Konzi vanhu vanoda majarini kumusha uko neshuga. Vavona life yacho ameno zvaingori. Then pane mainzi musiwo mekuti manheru ndo mamaitandarira muchimwa chibuku nechije. Vanhu vaingogara manje muchirumu mazuva ano rumu yakaitonga ine mune maakugara kana 3 makagandira nemakiteni naambogara. So what happens is the other issue is pane yainzi haifirinzeri muriwo. Hanzi varungu vaibva vatiwa kupa ubva pane poto 2 yemuriwo nesadza. So zvasiyana nezvedu mazuva ano zvekuti ane mapani nechii. So waiti kubika sadza kuita pani yemanyama, pani yechi. So yainzi haifirinzika yanga iri yekuti waizomixa vegetables nenyama vozoda mapoto 2 kuti zvibalance, something like that. So that's the life that they created for us, something like that. So yakatotangira kuland then nekumaresidenja. So mablacks aingogara mutown. So kutown kwaitorema uri kumusha uko ndozoti munhu ari kuharare. Baba vangu ari kushanda kuharare, havasi kuda basa rekuswera dhari kwachaenda mbuya. Baba vangu ari kugara kuharare, vari kushandira varungu. Zvaitopisa. So tiri paland apportionment act ipapo between 1931 and 1941 50,000 Africans were moved into reserve due to the Land Apportionment Act. Between 1954 and 1959, a further 85,000 were moved. They were always on the move. Like, yes, people were always moved from this point to this point. They were moved from white farms, and between 1964 and 1977, another 88,000 were sent into reserves. So the Land Apportionment Act was defended on the grounds that this would attract white immigrants. Because my white immigrants kuti apinde white auye yanga iri nyaya yekuti vaitanga vaona kuti murumburarama sei as whites hamuna kusangana here nevanhu veblack up. So the black majority was left with insufficient land both for farming and settlement, and what was being protected was white agriculture, and in this case segregation was central, and Europeans feared competition from blacks. So thus land was divided between blacks and whites for security reasons. The act largely denied Africans access to land and other means of production, and the land assigned to Africans was a bit far away from markets and lines of communication, while white farms were adjacent to markets. White farms, they were near roads. I think ukafamba highway unaona mangu mabraza side of my highways. Yes, they were near roads, they were near railway lines, you know. So I found him na Bromley, wana Milford. Ukada ufamba ndikuenda unana wedza. Varungu vangu vaka set up imwe kuti achingobva ngorima mapotatoes ake achingopinda murori, njanji iri padhuze, road iri padhuze, and ukada kutarisa njanji neonizva zviri padhuze nepadhuze zvangofana nerailway yeHarare to Mutare. You find out kuti njanji zvinoto pan time dzinotokrosana side by side, you know. It was a setup yema whites in such a way. So you find out that through the Land Apportionment Act, the Rhodesian government undermined African agriculture by creating a white farming community heavily subsidized by the government and growing similar crops with Africans. And Afigbo argued that aided by cheap labor, loans and scientific assistance, commercial farming by whites of maize and tobacco became profitable because they could get like why was it profitable? Why shan't someone? Yes. So the whites had the advantage of cheap land, nearness to main roads, railways, markets, loans to buy machinery, and were paid much higher prices for their crops and livestock than African farmers. So African farmer ita kabuditsa ma crops ake, blacks akabuditsa ma crops ake. Even a white are poor quality. Vaipa white mari vaibhadhara mari yakawanda to the white. It was so unfair. So Stoneman argues that markets were far away from reserves and prices were deliberately kept low for African cattle and agricultural produce. And Stoneman also argues that colonialism and capitalism had taken form of a sort of a proletarianization of the peasantry, which had created labor supply for the capitalist sector by destroying the viability of the peasant agricultural production. So the Land Apportionment Act was meant to end debates on the land question between the blacks and the whites, and it was meant to protect white minority groups. And this act restricted Africans from buying land every way, that is to ease the danger of serious economic threats from the new class of African farmers. So the Land Apportionment Act, in other words, suppressed the African rights. Right? How? So it had its effect that the policy of segregation had serious repercussions on African farming. Like peasant agriculture clearly declined after the creation of reserves, and further declined after the passing of the Land Apportionment Act. Pakatutisa kuma reserves zvakatoita worse, zvakatoita bad. Then Land Apportionment Act became from bad to worse. So this was due to the adverse ecological conditions and to the shortage of space for both cultivation and grazing, which resulted in overcrowding and overstocking. All this contributed to diminishing agricultural returns to an African population to whom land was traditionally the most important asset. So the Land Apportionment Act was therefore a source of hardships and suffering, you know. And again, the government also engaged in destocking, right? Like it was encouraged by settler government, thus disturbing the traditional life of cattle keeping. Cattle rearing was very important in as far as every Bantu tribe was concerned. Like the cattle grades were low because of poor grazing land. Thus cattle owned by Africans weighed so little in comparison to those owned by the whites, because the whites took the best land, so their cattle had the best grazing land. mombe dzakatanga kufanidzana ende bvatanga kutoti mombe dzenyu futi dziri kurwara vakatanga kuuraya enge redestocking futi iyo. So there was overstocking and overpopulation in reserves. This created problems in soil conservation. Overstocking and overpopulation resulted in serious soil erosion, hence reducing agricultural productivity in all African reserves. And Africans were now driven into the wage economy, right? Yes. Because Africans, you cannot separate an African with his land, with his soil. So the Africans were in a desperate situation. They didn't have the land. So what was the next step? The next step was to move into the wage economy. And where was the wage economy? In the towns. Like pepe papa mataxis andikuona zvawakaita vakatanga kutekisa vanhu ende vaiti tikuda taxi iri in form of cash hatisoti mubhadhara nehuku butter trade zvamaiita kurose state tikuda mari ivo vaizendovegwa nemari yacho. So you're now forced kunoshanda kufamu nekumaini. So apa they were now pushed in the wage economy. Vakutonoshanda kutogadzira bhutsu butter meno kwangwa kutoshanda mutauni wakuvhura maindustry makutoshanda, so that you can also work for them, So sekuru wangu vaitoshandira paidzi paward of court vanga vari caretaker. Sekuru kudhara wana mumzi wangu because varungu vanga vakavhura futi maflats mutown. But sometimes they could open my flats, then point them magana to my blacks. I got my flats in Mumum. Vanike vachishandira futi varungu. Because concept in my flats yange yekuisa futi mamwe blacks. Because papa ne mamwe mabasa vaiita offices. Then poito mamwe blacks like the educated elite. They could need some blacks vaizoshanda kana sema receptionist nechichi. So vaibva vavakira maflats. So sekuru wangu vaishanda maflats ikoko kwainzi kuward of court. So we could commute every day. So vaitoenda makuseni vachita make sure to clean vodzoka kuita sei. That was sort of the system. So there was underdevelopment of African areas because most people were turned into migrant laborers. Thus there was exploitation of human resources. Thus the dependent syndrome also developed among the African population because munhu ari kukuomesera ndiyo unobva kutodependa naye. Like varungu vaicreate, we call it artificial poverty. They created artificial poverty. They made life difficult so that you can turn up to them. Yes, that's what they did. Yeah, there are some like that's what most religious leaders do. That's what most prophets do. Like they cast fear in you so that you can turn to them. Shamari panati twako shamari. Paukaenda umba kwa musuya. Mazuwa wakamwaya pane zvawakaisa mazuwa meme. So kuti zvinhu zvako zvifambe kwakufanira kutsvaga muteuro wemvura clear water. Kunotoda bhazi kuti tinotsvaga mvura iyoyo saka but ndinayo so modipa $30 tokupa mvura iyoyo. So akuisa fear. So he created the problems, then he came up with the solution. That person is very bad. Kunoona unoomesa zvinhu aomesa zvinhu zvacho oita ndo zvaiita mawaizi anyatsoita life unbearable. Then at the same time kuti shamari uda mari kai uya ushando. But situation ndiye anenge aicreate. Anenge acreate a tough situation. Casta fear mauri. One fear iye ubva aita solution futi. So religion is created based on fear. Religion in general. Inyaya yekungoti hangu handikuiti separate, but those are some of the things that we teach. Religion in most cases is created on fear. Vanhu vanotya kuenda kugehena. Vanhu vanotya kuroyiwa. Vanhu vanotya kubhuroka. Vanhu vanotya kutambura. So kana uchida kutanga church you based on those things. So the people will run to you as their savior. So kada utasa pese panotanga religion. Even Satan achitsanangura neBhayibheri anoparita nefear. Fear ndo yanoshandisa kuisa mwana. So aoparita nefear vanhu munenge wakutsvaga kuti ndoita sei kuti ndibude mufear. That's how a church is started. So if you want to start a church, the psychology of starting a church, you have to cast fear in people. So they also started the Maize Control Act indosaka ndisingavhunduke zvekuudzwa chamari ukasadai ndakamboudzwa zeye ukasadai ucharoya zvako uchatadza kufamba chanebva ratonoti allright bcause ndozvaanoita unofanira kufarira vanhu unofanira kudai nevanhu bcause ndokuti zvako zvifambe ukasadaro chete zvichadzoka back to zero zvichadhakwa zvichaita sei so anongada kuti utye so that aiwa inandikwata ukangokwata chete mulife muno unoitiswa right. So pane tichiextenda futi pane yavakazoisa inonzi the Maize Control Act of 1935. This act protected white farmers from black competition in maize production. There were two grades of maize. A grade was for whites and B grade for blacks. So a grade fetched a higher price while B grade fetched a lower price. So thus there was a discrimination in the market. The whites also paid less for maize they bought from the Africans. So maiti mukaunza chibage high quality yemunhu mutema hanzi sagara kuti tikupa $10 chete, but lower quality yemurungu same saga futi yonzi tikupa $50, you know. So there was also the cattle levy act. Like according to this act, white paid less at the market for cattle bought from the blacks. The government paid more to whites for their cattle, and this system impoverished the blacks who were being affected by this fraudulent commercial arrangement. So there was also the Native Land Husbandry Act. The Native Land Husbandry Act. Like Africans were accused of inefficiency in management of natural resources, especially land. Vati palendi yacho Land Apportionment Act vakutanga kutaura futi kuti vanhu vacho kungomuchengetedza land, hamugoni masoil or land conservation methods, muri madofu ndozvavaita hanzi zvinonzi kana hanzi kana bere rakuda kuti ndogara ndichiita hanzi kana bere rakuda kudya vana varo vanotanga kuva accuse kuti muri kunhuhwirira kunga mbudzi tapfana chekuone ringira nenzara kuti totanga kungotaura pana vari kunhuhwirira mbudzi panapa fana rikaenda pokufemedza mbudzi kuti so already inenge yatokasta mupfungwa dzako, unotanga kutofira kuti pamwe utori mbudzi. So ari kuzokusendera message yekuti chada kutokudya. So sometimes when people want to denigrate something vanotanga kushora. Ndosaka ndinoti munhu kana asingachadi munhu anotanga kumudressa down. That's the first thing which happens. Zvakadofo izvi. Ndicho ndakambodani neseyo ndandambonyanyoita semunhu asina kana grade 7. Masigns iwayo kuti munhu achanakirwi. Anenge atine plan yaanenge ainayo. So ndo zvakatanga kuita mawhites akatanga kuita dress down. So they said the Africans are using sledges. So the act was meant to enforce good management through promoting conservative methods. Africans were therefore forced to supply labor for digging conjour ridges in rural areas. So ma-Africans akabanzi futi akufana kusupply labor kuti vadige tinomati makandiwa conjour ridges. Taimboita farming yakadaro kwakutaro kwekuti panenge paine zvimuomba so nemuchirima pakati pezvimuomba zvinobatsiridza kuti mvura isairidze. So the native commissioner was given power to control stock, number of cattle, goats and sheep an individual could have. Like the native commissioner could tell kuti anofanira kunge nemombe dzakati, mbudzi dzakati nechi. So the commissioner could stipulate a safe maximum number of cattle in his area, and excess cattle were destocked. They could like force kuti mombe idzo dzitengeswe nelow price. Somebody mombe one chitoitengesa $50 tira kupisa mombe pana. Africans were forced to possess grazing permits as a way of controlling stock. So you were supposed to have a certificate or a permit of the area dziri kugrazera mombe dzako. So villages were forced to introduce crop rotation in their farming to control soil erosion and increase agricultural production. The measures introduced were greatly opposed by Africans, especially because of the nature of impositions. And my traditional chiefs futi vakaramba. Yes. So the subsequent effect of forced destocking was it forced many people to go to urban areas. That's when rural to urban migration started. And Africans remained low as Africans were not given enough capital. And the general opposition to these policies was to capitalize into the modern African nationalism in the 1950s and 1960s, which is our next lesson. Because my Africans are going to parties so that they could liberate themselves. So we are going towards the second break, right? So the 1969 Land Tenure Act, like this, replaced the 1930 Land Apportionment Act, because it further divided land into 3 categories. European land was about 45 million acres. That is 46.6 total of the land, and African's land was like 45%. That was around 46.6. The remainder, that is 6.7 land, became national land. So they also came up with the Land Tenure Act, that was in 1977. So Papa near 1969, then Vawai modify for 1977. Like now the armed struggle. Yanga yangu ya kuto ondo yanga ya kutshiridza. Because that was one independence in 1977, that's when they came up with the Land Tenure Act. So the government was once again forced to come up with the 1977 Land Tenure Act, and this was a revision of the 1969 Land Tenure Act, which officially removed the racial division of land. Because when we went to kuchiwa kuta sekuti vakugadzirisa zviya kuti Africans itora land ayo atora ya sorry was vavashata. So that's it for this lesson. Tida kubata inonzi African nationalism. Ndo pateta kupinda na formation of ZANU-PF nana to not alpha.